Good evening. I'm Linda Yueh. I'm Adjunct Professor of Economics here at the school. I'm delighted to chair this Great Economists Debate. Now, it's to mark the publication of my new book, The Great Economists. Thank you, Andrew. I can't do that myself. And I thought, what better way to celebrate great economists than to have a conversation with two current great economists. And that's what we're planning to do this evening. So let me introduce the current great economists that I have here on my panel. Firstly, to my right, John Kay. He's a leading economist with just absolutely wonderful insights. I actually don't think I need to introduce John. Many of you will be familiar with him through both his work and his writing for the Financial Times. A lot of his research is on the intersection of economics and business. His career has been just stellar. It has spanned academia. He's been a professor, dean at Oxford, London Business School, can claim an affiliation with John. He's been working with think tanks, company directorships, consultancies, investment companies. And to my left is Andrew Scott. I don't really think I need to introduce Andrew to this audience. Almost everyone here will have had either the pleasure of being taught by Andrew or read his textbook, Macroeconomics, which is what I use in my courses and is widely used. But I'll just give him a bit of an introduction. So Andrew is another leading economist, professor here of economics. He was previously at Harvard, London School of Economics, Oxford. He has also a rare distinction, I think, for academics, which I should say that John has also written some really well-sold books. So I'm with two people who are rare. Andrew's book that he wrote with Linda Gratton here at the school, The 100-Year Life, is a bestseller, and it is absolutely a superb book. So the idea of this evening is that for about 35 minutes or so, we are going to have a conversation on the big economic challenges of our time. And I'm going to get our current great economists to answer some of the big questions that I pose in my book. And the other thing to say is I will give us a short introduction to each of the big economic challenges and where the idea originally came from for trade theory or whatever the topic is. And then we'll open it up to a conversation, and then there'll be a time for Q&A for about 20-25 minutes after that. The first topic that I thought we would try and tackle is, should the government rebalance the economy? So we have heard about the March of the Makers, this idea that the British and American governments have been trying to move the economy towards making things once again, towards manufacturing, away from services. And should the government be doing this? And the idea of the market developing in the way that it has stems originally from Adam Smith, who is the father of economics. He's the first great economist that I write about. He is the one who came up with the concept of the invisible hand, this idea that without government action, supply and demand would determine prices and quantities in an economy. What he would have made of rebalancing the economy, I think, would have been maybe a little bit of a struggle. But the fact that the British and American economies are predominantly driven by services, he might also have had a slight issue with, because he believed the services sector was comprised of buffoons and opera singers. Adam Smith, in general, was a bit skeptical about governments being too active in the economy. So the quote that I picked out that I think best encapsulates some of his views is, "There is no art which one government sooner learns of another than that of draining money from the pockets of the people." So that's what the idea of the invisible hand and markets being efficient comes from. So let me ask our great economists today, John, should the government rebalance the economy?
No. But let me expand a bit, because if we're attributing all this to Adam Smith, we should recognize that Adam Smith is not actually the kind of rabid free marketeer that he's been represented by right-wing forces of the 20th century as being. Adam Smith was skeptical about government intervening in the economy. Adam Smith was skeptical about absolutely everybody. There isn't a single group who emerges well from the wealth of nations. Particularly, I'd remind you, Oxford professors, Linda, whom he says have given up even the pretense of teaching.
In the tradition of Oxford, he was largely self-taught.
Yes. And this goes on. He denounces merchants, he denounces the rich. As I say, he denounces everybody. So you have to see it in this context of general skepticism. And if you look at The Invisible Hand, quote, in the context, which most people don't, it's not saying something that everything will automatically rebalance itself. It's actually saying that you don't need to have protectionism because people will tend to buy products from home suppliers anyway, which is not quite the way people who haven't read anything of Adam Smith other than that phrase interpret it. The other thing we need to notice is in Adam Smith's day, the idea that you might export services was ludicrous. You know, opera, he quoted opera singers, as you've mentioned. The idea that you could export opera in 1770 was utterly ridiculous. If you'd said nowadays you would have opera performers globe-trotting around the world, you'd have people flying from around the world to go to operas at La Scala, that you would have people listening to recordings of opera everywhere in the world, he would have been amazed. I think this is something we'll keep coming back to in this evening, because although many of these people have ideas that transcend their time, their ideas were formed in their particular time.
Thank you, John. Andrew, should government rebalance the economy?
So there's sort of two words of rebalance here. One is the balance between market and governments, and the other is between services and manufacturing. And, you know, I don't think there's any necessary superiority about manufacturing compared to services. What you want is an economy that provides a good standard of living for everyone, which is about being high productive. And as you talk about in the book, much of manufacturing, or the money you get from manufacturing, is actually services anyway. The pharmaceutical companies with their R&D, they also, their design, etc. So we are a service-based economy. And of course, it's interesting too to see how technology would change that, because, it's not manufacturing is a small part of the economy, not because we don't produce much manufacturing. It's just increasingly low value what we produce because of productivity growth. And what makes the service sector such a source of value add is it's been hard to get productivity growth. So it can be very interesting with robots providing more and more a substitute for people, which I think will help British manufacturing, and technology and AI improving productivity in the service sector and reducing value in some sectors, to see what will happen going forward. But I think there is a way in which rebalancing may be required, and John's written on this as well. We had a financial crisis because the financial sector got very large as part of the economy. And I think we still have to have a discussion about what size financial sector we want. And I'm not sure the regulatory agenda has been finished there. And then I think, as John said, Smith was cynical about everyone. And of course, he's writing at a time as well where the state had been majorly rent-seeking and was then beginning to recede, and you're beginning to see the growth of business, of trade. And so that was bringing about the beginnings of prosperity. And as John says, all these great economists were writing in their time, and you can see why he was focusing on the market and the government should keep out of things. But I think another thing that comes through time and again in all these economists is they're great economists because they're solving an issue that's particularly acute at that moment in time. And they're providing a new insight and a new way of thinking about it. And every time we have a new technology which changes the means of production, that changes who grabs the means of production, the first people to exploit it are business. It's the people who want to make profit from it. And then that creates some challenges for other groups in society and for society as a whole. And so the initial response to technology is to exploit it financially, but then start to regulate and change the regulation. And I think that's a little bit what we're seeing at the moment with the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, the rise of monopoly power. We are beginning to see a government saying, I need to change regulation or re-regulate. So I think we will see something of a rebalancing because of that.
You know what's behind a lot of this? I think of it as manufacturing fetishism.
Yeah.
Is the idea that real work is hard manual labour performed by men. And hard manual labour performed by women is not real work. And the kind of jobs that most of us in this room do, which are rather pleasant, intellectual, relatively well paid, are not proper work. And we have something in all of our minds, which is evolutionarily generated, I suspect, that has this kind of thought. And we just need to get over it, frankly.
Oh, well put indeed. So let's move from a Scottish economist writing in the 18th century who Adam Smith founded the classical school of economics. He had adherents like David Ricardo, who was the father of international trade. But not everybody agreed with the classical economists. So the next question that we are going to move to is by a 19th century economist, the German Karl Marx. So Karl Marx rejected the idea of the classical economists and market economy. He grew up in Germany, which also saw the advent of industrialization, the time that Adam Smith was writing about, which occurred first in Britain and then laterally in the continent. But he saw industrialization in a very different light. Adam Smith viewed industrialization as the root of prosperity. Karl Marx viewed capitalism and industrialization this way. He wrote in the Communist Manifesto, "May the ruling classes tremble at the thought of a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose in that revolution but their chains." And he also wrote, "Has the bourgeoisie ever effected progress without dragging individuals and people through blood and dirt, through misery and degradation?" Now, Karl Marx never lived to see communism take hold and spread in the former Soviet Union and then laterally in China. He lived most of his life in exile, in fact, in London. And he died here in disappointment because during his lifetime, some of the best thinkers of the day had never heard of him. His work was only really read in Germany. So often disappointed in his lifetime, for instance, with the French Revolution. In 1851, when Louis Napoleon Bonaparte titled himself Emperor Napoleon III, much as his uncle Napoleon Bonaparte had, Marx wrote, "History repeats itself. The first time as tragedy, the second time as farce." So, the biggest communist country in the world, which is biggest in population and the second biggest in terms of the economy, is China. So, can communist China become rich? Andrew.
Can the Chinese economy get rich under the Chinese Communist Party, or can communist China get rich? There's two separate questions there, because clearly the sort of economic policies that are in place in China would not be ones that standard Marxism would say were communism. So I think there's two issues there. The communism and not a market economy, and clearly China has got a market economy. It's just got, from a Western perspective, very unusual interplay between states, companies and individuals. And that then I think plays into the second question, which is more of the institutional side. Can a state-led, a single-party state become rich? And we can't see it anywhere in the world where that's happened. So that's an empirical statement. So the question is it theoretically possible? And the theme that goes through, to my mind, was very interesting looking at all the economists, is their focus on institutions and rent-seeking. You talk about North as sort of really bringing together those strands, but it's there right the way along. I think if the Communist Party carries on the way it is, it will carry on in degrees of rent-seeking, which of course we see in the West. The financial crisis showed us there was some rent-seeking happening in the West as well. But it's hard to imagine how China as a whole can fully reach the same GDP per capita that you see in the US. And other Western countries in its current form.
John.
Well, I think you answered Linda's question briefly, Andrew, by saying that China isn't communist in any relevant sense. So that's almost the end of that discussion. And I looked at, I think it's on page 71 of your book, Linda, where you had a very interesting list. Wanted to remind everyone I read it. And which you had a very interesting list of what Marx thought a properly organized economy would look like. And I read that list and asked, where would Amazon or Apple or Facebook fit into that list? And the answer is they wouldn't and couldn't, because the economy Marx was talking about was one in which industrial production was industrial production, and there was the capitalist who owned the mill or the steel workers, and there were people who went to work there. And for better or worse, our economy just isn't like that anymore. So if you ask, could the state own the means of production? Facebook? I don't even know what that question means. The state could own Facebook, I suppose, but I think it would be the end of Facebook.
Well, China is doing something similar, actually, at the moment. So
social grading,
yeah.
indeed.
But I thought what was interesting about the Marx one is that you've absolutely got to include Marx as one of the great economists in terms of their impact. But in terms, as John says, the 10 things that make a successful economy, he'd fail the class. I mean, he sort of, and you know, there have been attempts to sort of translate the invisible hand into a state planner, and you can absolutely do that. But the Marxist system itself is still very hard to generate an intellectually consistent and coherent system from it. But I did also think in reading through it that Marx and Schumpeter were the two who perhaps spoke most about the really big issues about today. Because Marx is writing at a time when technology has upended the political system and there's inequality. And that sort of dialectic that he borrows from Hegel, you hear from Piketty, the Great Leveler book, this idea that there's an inherent instability in capitalism, that growing inequality will eventually lead to a crisis, is becoming stated more and more. Whether it's true, I don't know. But
Well, Marx always believed that communism couldn't coexist with capitalism. So in his view, capitalism leads to crisis, probably through inequality, was that what he latterly decided. And that would lead to revolution, and then that would lead to communism. So I think if China became rich, he would say, yes, an unequal rich China is ripe for a communist revolution.
Yeah. And on page 94, to borrow John's... I may have made that number up, but I'm an economist, so that's absolutely fine. But you make a very interesting point that actually, you know, the internal inconsistencies were found to be in communism rather than capitalism, which I thought was a nice point.
But when you quoted, Linda, Marx as saying, could economies become rich without dragging people through degradation, etc., etc., we know the answer to that question now, and it's yes.
Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah. So, moving now to the late Victorian era, the latter part of the 19th century, Alfred Marshall, the Cambridge economist, started the English neoclassical economics school. He introduced the idea of marginalism. So he was the first one to do supply and demand diagrams, bringing you back memories of Andrew's textbook and of our lectures. But like many of the great economists in the book, they tackled big questions. He didn't just focus on the narrow equilibrium concepts. In fact, a lot of Alfred Marshall's work looked at the role of government in redistribution, what can be done in terms of poverty. And that's a very Victorian perspective. And it's a debate that we still have today. So one quote from his that I think captures this kind of balance between being a neoclassical economist, but still thinking there was scope to intervene in terms of social justice is this one. He wrote, "The function of government is to govern as little as possible, but not to do as little as possible." So the question posed here is inequality inevitable in a market economy? John?
Well, we can answer that question pretty briefly by saying yes as well. But let me go on a little longer as I'm...
Your version of this book would be very short, John.
Probably would.
You wouldn't need a chapter.
20 questions to which you can give yes or no answer.
Yeah. These great economists got to ask more difficult questions, haven't they?
But actually, everyone is talking about inequality at the moment, a discussion which is largely data-free, apart from Piketty's book, which is data-rich, but argument-free to my mind. If you want to understand Piketty, I think you have to remember that a central fact, which is the richest person in France, and probably the richest woman in the world when he wrote, was Lillian Bettencourt, who was a silly old woman with a very large amount of inherited wealth. And actually, going back to Marx, the time of Marx and Marshall, that was largely still true then. The people who had large amounts of wealth had it either in the form of land, agricultural land typically, or they were the people who owned the plants we were talking about a moment ago. Now, apart from Lillian Bettencourt, who's now dead, it isn't like that anymore. If you ask who the richest people in the world are today, you come up with Jeff Bezos. What is Jeff Bezos's or Mark Zuckerberg's wealth based on? It's a capitalization of the expected future profits of Facebook and Amazon. That's a very different form of wealth to the one we were talking about a century ago. And it's a form of wealth that has very different social implications. Now, I am concerned about inequality, but I think we need to focus on income inequality, which is probably what really matters. And we need also to ask what has really happened. And what has happened in Britain over the last 25 years is that people at the bottom and the top of the income distribution have benefited relative to people in the middle. And that is also what has happened around the world in terms of global inequality as well. That there's been a spectacular reduction in global poverty, mainly as a result of growth in China and India and Southeast Asia more generally. But at the same time, largely as a result of financialization of our economy and the knock-on effect of that on corporate executives, the top, as it were, 1% of the income distribution has done very well. And that's the dominant phenomenon of our time, and its implications socially, economically, politically are really quite complicated.
Thank you, John. Andrew.
Big topic. I mean, John gave us a one-word answer to is capitalism inevitable to produce inequality, and said yes. Piketty gives us three.
Not that it increases. That wasn't Gunder's question. It was, is inequality inevitable in a market economy?
And of course, Piketty gives also a three-character reply, which is that R is greater than G.
Yes, that's right.
It would slightly more insightful than yes, but it may not be true. You talked about Marshall. So Marshall is about people get paid their marginal product. And of course, if skills differ across people, then people's marginal product would differ. You're going to get inequality. So then I guess from that perspective, the question is that fair in a social sense? It may be fair in an efficient sense. I think what's really interesting in the case of Facebook that John's talking about is actually, I don't think marginal productivity is the thing to look at here. And I think that's one of the big shocks we've got with this intangible capital and this sudden creation of a big new source of wealth, which has changed the distribution of income and the economics of superstars, etc. I think is creating some real challenges. And it's interesting, I think, these great economists all came up with an answer to a current problem. I do wonder what the new tools or the new models will be that economics will come up with to address some of these issues with a technology where capital and labour are being redefined and marginal product seems to be not such a key product.
It's interesting, Andrew, because we've just been comparing Marshall and Marx. And Marx would have defined income distribution by reference to differences in marginal productivity. And Marx would have looked at it in terms of bargaining over economic rents. And on that front, I think, in a modern economy, Marx has a lot more to say than Marshall.
And I think that's what's interesting too about the capitalist, because no market economy exists without a government. The very action of exchange requires a legal system that is enshrined in some sense by the government. And when you have a state, then you start to get different bargaining powers between different groups. And the extent to which current inequality is being created by a shift of bargaining power rather than a shift of technology is, I think, something that is politically very interesting and obviously chimes in with the rise of populism.
I think this one of the parts about this debate is also if there is a level of inequality that's too high, what can you do about it? And the debate has a political dimension, and it's about how much you redistribute and whether you redistribute. So there's an old political joke in the United States that I think captures this debate quite well. So it goes something like this. If a Republican sees a drowning man, he'll throw a rope that is too short and say, the arrest is up to you. A Democrat will throw a rope that's too long and lets go of his end. And so is it about self-help, which is a very Victorian concept, or should we be thinking harder about redistribution and what that means, as Andrew suggested, in a kind of economy where you have to redefine capital and labor, which actually brings me nicely to the next question, which is what drives innovation. So Joseph Schumpeter, so this is the other big economic school of thought. It wasn't just the neoclassical economists or the Marxists. It was also the Austrian school of economics writing at this time during the First Industrial Revolution. And Joseph Schumpeter, like many of the greats, didn't just create this concept of creative destruction. He was also interested in what creative destruction said about capitalism, being the engine of capitalism. And like the other Austrian that I'm going to mention in a moment, Friedrich Hayek, the Austrians were not known for being concise and they were a bit less witty than others. So, in fact, Friedrich Hayek, his students at the LSE asked him to lecture in German because his English was so hard to understand. So Joseph Schumpeter.
Did they find the German any easier to understand?
In terms of so Joseph Schumpeter. The quote I'm going to use is actually from Winston Churchill, because I think it actually captures what he was trying to argue for in his best-known book published in 1944, which was called Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. So he equated creative destruction with capitalism and the capitalist system pushing back against socialism, which was gaining currency at the time. So Winston Churchill said, "The inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessings. The inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of miseries." That relates to what we just talked about, but I want to focus on this idea of what drives innovation. John, what drives innovation today, and could today's innovations, like some of the ones that you've mentioned, really lead to the same kind of progress that we have seen through the previous industrial revolutions?
I would think so. And we really know, I think, the basics of what drives innovation, which is it's entrepreneurship based on scientific and technological advance. Now, having said that, that doesn't tell you how you do it, but it tells you basically what the sources are. And Schumpeter, as you say, I think it's an immensely fertile book. It's one of these, this is a big book, which is Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. It's a big book in the sense that there are lots of interesting and provocative ideas in it, but it doesn't add up to a coherent whole, really. And if one asks the question, which is in a sense fundamental to his argument, is he believing that innovation comes from big business or small business? I'm not clear what the answer to that is, because there's a lot of emphasis on entrepreneurship on the one hand, but there's also a lot of emphasis on the capacity of large monopoly businesses to innovate. Now, I think we now have a better idea of the answer to that, which is I've thought a bit and written a bit about the history of the computing industry, essentially. How did that information technology revolution that has changed all our lives happen? And the answer is it didn't happen with the big companies like IBM and Xerox, which interestingly played a significant role in the underlying development of the ideas. but did not play a large role in the effective commercial development of them. That was done by the entrepreneurs at Microsoft, at Apple, and Intel, and so on. And I think that's a pointer to what are essentially the drivers of innovation.
Andrew.
Well, I mean, John's been an entrepreneur and studied entrepreneur, so I've got little to add. I'm a macroeconomist, and it's certainly from a macro point of view and possibly a micro point of view, entrepreneurship always seems like the ghost in the machine to me. It's sort of, we know it's important, but actually sort of grabbing hold of it, it's a bit of a will-o'-the-wisp analytically. So, you know, there's obviously two parts of it, as John said. There's the entrepreneurship and there's the exploitation of knowledge. And your question is sort of, can we expect technology to continue to grow? And I think the answer surely is yes. I mean, there's that fantastic Isaac Newton quote, you know, I was standing on the shoulders of giants. If every generation is as smart as the previous generation, they inherit that knowledge and they add something. I think, you know, it's sort of interesting to me seeing perhaps different types of knowledge because, you know, we've got this massive stock of ideas, and Paul Romer sort of once said, well, the more ideas you got, the more you can combine them in different ways and exploit things. And I think what's interesting about, you know, the web is the ability now to sort of combine bits of information is a lot greater than it used to be. So I do wonder if we may see less pioneering deep research in one area, and we may see a lot of innovations coming from just combining things in different areas. I mean, certainly as an academic, specialization is the way to go, but we've got a technology now that enables you to learn very easily and quickly across a range of different topics.
I think that's a big question, and we might want to come back to it when we talk about Bob Solow and economic growth.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think we should move to that in the interest of time, so we can fit in just two more before we open it up. But I think, naturally move to, do we face a slow growth future? We've already hinted that that's actually one of the big debates of our time. And a lot of the slow growth future has to do with technology, although not wholly, because Robert Solow, who is the author of the neoclassical growth model, he wrote his articles in the 1950s, and he said that growth is comprised of capital, labor, and technology. But in 1987, he made this observation, which became known as the Solow paradox. The computer age is seen everywhere, except in the productivity data. And he also said, I always thought the biggest difference the computer made in my office was that before the computer, my secretary used to work for me, and afterward, I worked for my secretary. So let me turn to Andrew, just to follow up on what you were saying before. Do we face a slow growth future? Do we have technologies today which are economy-wide in terms of productivity improving? Are the inventions of today comparable to the electrification, the internal combustion engine of the first and second industrial revolution? That's what this quote is getting at.
So there's the question, do we face a slow growth future? And you know, if I can give no numbers and no dates, I can answer both yes and no to this question.
You know, but it's the thing about forecasts.
Exactly.
You either give a forecast or a date, but not both.
3 rules of forecasting. First rule is never give a number. Second rule, give a number, never give a date. And the third rule of forecasting, if you give a number and a date, you never come back again. So it's clear something's happening to productivity growth. But actually, before I go down answering that question about productivity growth, I think what's really interesting, of course, again, seeing things from the scope of history and the great economists, is GDP is a very modern concept. And for most of these great economists, they weren't thinking of GDP.
No.
And so, you know, one of the big issues right now is GDP capturing some of the welfare benefits that we're seeing, or has it ever captured some of those welfare benefits? And I think that's a really important distinction, because I think we are seeing substantial improvements in longevity, in health, as well as sort of consumer surplus that aren't captured in GDP. So we may well see continued growth in welfare, even if that's not being captured in GDP. Then there's the homework question, what's going to happen to GDP growth? And clearly the impact of a big financial crisis has lowered investment rate, and I think that's lowered productivity growth. So now, if the crisis is finally behind us and we start to see growth and investment, we should see some of these new technologies being installed and start to have an effect. And then, you know, is it as big as electricity? Gordon writes really well on just how wonderful the benefits of electricity
Robert
were.
Gordon's book.
No, I mean, and you know, he's kind of relentless with it. But it's true, that was a big boost, and this technology may be good, but is it as good as that? But it's clear that technologists always sort of overestimate how quickly the stuff comes through. It takes a while to happen, and you know, we can all see there's something coming down the road, and it would be extraordinary were that not to raise productivity in GDP as well as some of those other welfare benefits.
You know, Andrew, it's interesting you raise this question of GDP as a relatively modern concept. It is a modern one, but it's not that modern. And the way we measure GDP was largely developed in the 1940s by two other great economists, James Mead and Richard Stone, working for the British government. And they're working for it during the war, and the question they were trying to answer was how much physical output could the British economy produce? Because that was the question that was critical to waging a war. And that structure has dominated the whole of the development of economic statistics since then. It's one of the reasons for the neglect of services. James Mead once told me that they discovered they'd forgotten hairdressing at some point, and he turned to Stone and said, "How often do you get your hair cut and how much do you pay?" And then he rang his wife and said, "How often do you get your hair cut and how much do you pay?" And that was the basis for the estimate of hairdressing in the first British national accounts.
Service is well measured, clearly.
Yes, right. So we shouldn't take all of these measures too seriously. But the big question now, and you've mentioned what I regard as a debate between two other great economists, which is Bob Gordon on the one hand and Joel Mokyr on the other. And the Gordon view is that the century from 1870 to 1970 was just amazing, and we will never have anything like that again. And there's a reasonable case to be made for that, and Gordon makes it at considerable length. And one thing that brought that argument home to me was when I came across an article from 1966 that said what technological innovations will make an impact in the next 50 years. And what I learned from that was they had underestimated a bit how much difference information technology would make, but everything else they overestimated. What would happen in transport, what would happen in materials, what would happen in pharmacology. We've had much less innovation than they anticipated then. Now that raises the question, where are we now? And the Mokyr view is to say we really haven't seen anything else yet in terms of the impact of information technology. That we've seen it in the areas that are closely related to information technology. In terms of Facebook and the mobile devices everyone has in this room has. But we're starting to see it. The driverless car is the epitome of something that is made possible by information technology, but automobiles are not about information technology. We know there's going to be huge data-driven and analysis-driven progress in healthcare. Again, it's not information technology, but it's driven by information technology. And that's in the sense that this will have the impact that electricity had, not after the immediate discovery and commercialization of electricity, but 50 years later. The big developments were in the 1920s, really, not the 1870s.
Wonderful. There's so many more questions, but I want to open it now up to the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, please, as I say, introduce yourself and let me know who you'd like to answer, or both panelists can answer any big economic questions you have on your mind. In the back, one of my lovely students. Microphone's coming around.
Hi, my name is Farhan. I am Linda's student from the Executive MBA Global Asia program. I'm also an entrepreneur. My question to both of you is, you've mentioned that the current way GDP is measured, it might not be completely accurate. So how would you now measure or suggest GDP should be measured?
I would go on measuring GDP exactly the same way we do now. because you have the great advantage of having a, a statistical series and a statistical concept that is comparable across history and across countries. I would at the same time want to look at a great many other measures of economic progress.
Yeah. No, I mean, GDP tells us something. And the two standard criticisms of GDP, it doesn't measure very well what it says it's measuring, which is the value of economic activity. And I think the statistical agencies do a fairly good job of trying to change that. And a lot of problems there around services, but particularly the public sector. But we do, as John says, have some international standards that help us learn something. And then I think the second criticism of GDP is there's lots of things it doesn't measure, which it doesn't pretend to. It's about, about welfare rather than the output of goods and services. And I think that's where the supplementation, I think, is needed. And it's sort of strange. I mean, John was talking about a fetish of making things and manufacturing, but policymakers have turned GDP into something of a fetish. It's a measure of economic activity done in the marketplace. Boom. That's kind of it. But we make a lot more of it than perhaps we should.
And people ask, people like you, Andrew, is it important that GDP growth, which was expected to be 0.5% in the last quarter, is actually 0.4%?
Yeah.
And if you knew anything about the construction of GDP at all, you would know that that is an absurd question.
Yeah, I mean, clearly it matters. When the economy is growing at 4% on average compared to 1% over 10 years, you can see that as a difference. And when you have a recession, you can feel it. But yes, the sort of the variations quarter by quarter and the measurement error mean that it is over-scrutinised. And anything that's over-scrutinised, you find lots of flaws in it. So I actually think it does a reasonably good job of what it tries to do, but its problems come from everyone trying to make it a lot more than it actually is.
Okay, this was the final assignment question for my course. The assignment was supposed to have been turned in on Monday. So, okay, just occurred to me.
Well, you're going to have to grade me and John as well now. That's the problem.
Clever
I
students.
think you have no choice, Linda, on that one.
Okay, another question, not related to an assignment, perhaps. The undue advantage.
Hello, my name is Andrew Haslam-Jones. I did the EMBA here some years ago.
So you're going to ask a question about an assignment you'd done before?
No.
And what the answer is?
No, something I hope that's quite new.
I remember that assignment.
I'm not sure this question was around 10 years ago, but what does the panel think of the introduction of a universal basic income? Will it happen? Should it happen? And how much will it be?
Great question, John.
Right. It won't happen, it shouldn't happen, and the third part of the question doesn't arise. And if you go to my website, as Linda recommended, you will find an explanation, a fairly detailed explanation, of why these things are true. Basically, either the level of basic income is so low that it doesn't serve a useful purpose, or it's the cost of it is so high that it's not manageable. So, frankly, I don't find it a very interesting debate.
I agree with the punchline. Actually, I think someone somewhere will probably introduce it, but as John says, at a level that doesn't solve the problem. So therefore, I have to have all sorts of other supplements on top of it. But I think someone somewhere will introduce and say, hey, this is great, everyone's going to get something. But it's got sort of two parts to it at the moment. One is it's a way of trying to solve the inequality challenge that we've discussed. The other is sort of the digital Athens story, that we're going to be so productive with technology that we can just sort of sit around and do nothing and we'll get a basic income and that will take care of us. I don't think it solves inequality problem and poverty problem. If it's universal, it has to be targeted. And I don't think we'll get into the digital Athens world to that extent.
Good question. Yep, question here and then here. So, thank you.
Hi there. My name's Nick. Thank you very much for a great talk. I wanted to come back to a question that you raised earlier about whether communism can deliver prosperity. And of course, this kind of depends on your definition of communism and also your definition of prosperity. But if you look at China under Deng Xiaoping, they raised the standard of living for more people more quickly than at any time in the world's history. That surely must quantify that at that particular stage of economic development, possibly kind of communism with Chinese characteristics or Deng Xiaoping thought would be able to deliver that. Do you agree that at this kind of particular point in time, a strong central government with sharing the means of
So what was the big change that Deng Xiaoping brought in compared to Mao Zedong? What would you say that was the trick? What was the change introduced?
So,
communism or market forces?
So you're right. Mao had, let's say, a very kind of evolved definition of communism. Absolutely. Deng Xiaoping, what he brought in was the market forces.
Yeah.
But it was the balance of that with the communism which allowed it to impact so many people at that particular stage of economic development.
I mean, it's going to be just, so you're saying China's communist today?
I'm saying that it's communist with Chinese characteristics.
Okay. So you say, then it all starts to get semantic. If the question is, do free markets bring about prosperity without government intervention, I think the answer is clearly no. I can't think of a single country that doesn't have a strong role for a government. And in fact, most of the countries that have problems with lawlessness are bad places to do business. I also can't think of a country that's rich that's gone down the pure communist route without market forces. So then the question is, what is the balance between government and markets? And does, at an early stage of development, is there an important role for the government in pushing the economy forward? Absolutely. And I think that's what you can see clearly from China. You know, there's not really a case of a country that's become rich through pure deregulation. And this is the challenge of a successful economy, getting that balance between a market and a government structure. Is it communism and Chinese characteristics? That seems to be very, very semantic. But I would say if you really think of communism, North Korea is the most obvious case right now. And I wouldn't say that's a poster child for communism. If you want to say China's main feature is communism, I'm not sure that's true. I think under Mao Zedong that would be a stronger statement. But it is an interesting balance, and the role of the state has clearly been massively influential in China's growth. And that has to be a lesson we learn from China's growth. Yeah.
You know, there's a class of problems that I call in my mind the sherry question. And this comes from quite a long time ago when I was asked to do a piece of work on why the sherry market in Britain had declined. And I came to realize quite quickly that the problem was not to explain why it had declined. The problem was why it had ever been so large in the first place. And the sherry question is relevant to a whole variety of problems, because the interesting question is not so much why China's recently grown so quickly, it's why China's economic performance was so bad for so long. And if you go back to when all of this begins, to the late 18th century, then it was touch and go whether an industrial revolution happened in Western Europe or happened in Southeast China. Well, we know the answer to that. We know that the answer has a lot to do with the kind of things Douglas North wrote about, which we haven't really had time to touch on, about the effects of institution. But the Chinese economy will grow rapidly if you just don't mess it up through political dysfunction, as it has been messed up for most of 2 centuries.
We have time to just squeeze in one last question.
So my question would be for each of the speakers, given all the great economists in Linda's book, or perhaps more broadly, who would you pick as your favourite economist and why?
Can pick yourself.
No, that's excluded.
Andrew, John, whoever wants to go first.
It's a tough question. If I look at the ones in Linda's book, which at least narrows the field a bit, I think I have to go back to Adam Smith, because he wrote about so many things so well in an original way, and very few people have managed to replicate that breadth and depth and humour since then.
Andrew.
It's a horrible question. And I think, I think there's 2 ways to answer. One is sort of to create shape from nothing is an extraordinary intellectual thing, and Smith does that brilliantly. And Marshall too's insights, I think, were superb. But I have to say, I got a bit weakness for the characters, and I think Irving Fisher sounds just extraordinarily fantastic. But I think I'd probably have to go for Keynes, because this was this extraordinary figure who just thought that ideas should change the world, and his role in life was to try and save capitalism. And in some ways, he is one of the most influential figures of the 20th century, up there with, the Mao Zedongs and the Stalins of this world, in terms of how he shaped the economy. And he just did it with an arrogance and a wit that is just staggering. To write a book and call it The General Theory is fairly ambitious. So I think I'd probably most like to go for a drink afterwards with Keynes, I think.
Yeah, and Keynes really does have the characteristic that you would really enjoy a dinner party with Keynes.
Yeah.
Whereas Schumpeter and Hayek are, I think, a different kettle of fish altogether. And I doubt if one would emerge feeling bruised from an evening with Adam Smith. A lot of these great economists were not really very nice people.
That's actually...
Great way to finish.
I was about to say that... I think the great economists that I've picked in this book are the ones who first came up with the seminal idea around markets, growth, development, and quality of growth. So in many ways, I think my choices are this baker's dozen. And like John and Andrew have said, one of the fascinating things about the greats is their lives, their colorful lives, their personalities. And the thing that really struck me about some of my favorites in here is how hard they were on themselves. So Joseph Schumpeter used to grade his work effort every day, end up with a mark of 50 for the week. Adam Smith was so disappointed with his life's accomplishments that he wanted all his manuscripts burned after his death. Irving Fisher, who was seminal in moving the headquarters of economics from Britain to America, he never gets included in books like this normally because he also predicted in 1929, October of that year, the stock market was on a permanently high plateau.
Be warned, Andrew.
And yet his work was really seminal. But I'll answer your question in a different way. I think if I had to choose the great economists, if this book were to come out in a few years' time, so in other words, moving away from the earlier vintage, I'm sitting with two great economists who I think have made the kinds of contributions that would make... No, seriously. Thank you two very much. Thank you. And thanks to all of you. And let me also thank Marta, who has been a fantastic event organizer. Her and her team are just superb in putting on these events. She's got a great series of events called Big Ideas, which I think is going to be just absolutely fantastic. So I hope to see many of you there. Also, huge thanks to Chris, who I think has single-handedly just elevated so many of the events and the work that the school has done. And thank you so much to all of you for being here, current and former students and friends of the LBS. Your questions are just absolutely, as Andrew said, horrible, difficult, challenging. That's what we like. Thank you again.